Hello. Good
Hello.
evening. Good evening. Good evening.
Howdy, everyone. It's good to see y'all.
Yes, it
We're
is
getting
so
plugged
good to see
into
you.
Facebook and all kinds of wonderful places.
We are live on Facebook.
And it's official.
And it's official. It says on there we're live, but I don't see it yet.
We'll just have to trust.
Yes.
Trust that it's live.
We're very excited it's Wednesday already. It's the middle of the week. I feel like we were just here because
Yeah.
I'm very excited for part 2 of the Hebrew history. These Hebrew roots of our faith. This is what so much of what we do in Inspired Life is really about, is understanding and learning the Hebrew roots of our faith, because it brings so much to our Christianity, to our walk, to our understanding of who God is. And it's very, very powerful. So if you didn't watch last week's, it's in our Facebook group here. You can also find it on our YouTube channel. I highly recommend that you do, because Dan is breaking down incredible, incredible Hebrew roots history that's so good. So tonight we are going to start off where we left off. So where we left off last week was talking a lot about how through Jesus, the Jew and the Gentile are completely unified in one body. And he shared a couple scriptures in Ephesians and in Corinthians. It's amazing. And I'll just read this one in 1 Corinthians 12. It says, "For just as the body is one, but has many parts, and all the parts of the body, though many, constitute one body, so it is with the Messiah. For it was by one Spirit that we were all immersed into one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free, and we were all given one Spirit to drink." So we talked so much last week about the importance of understanding that Christianity is not Christianity without its Hebrew roots.
Right.
And so we're going to dig in tonight, because where we left off was how Western Christianity wildly embraced two beliefs: that Israel had been rejected by her God, and two, that the church was now the new Israel. So Dan is going to break into that a lot. There's so much to unpack here, and it's so good. So I recommend, if you can, take some notes. But if you don't have your book from last year, this is all in our guide, and the new guide is going to be available
Coming soon.
by the end of this week. We did a
Yeah,
final.
I mean, we're literally getting it. It's going to go get published this week. So
it's getting published. So we will let you know. If you are a member and you are going and renewed, we've got our group that has renewed. You will be getting this in the mail, the new one in the mail, and to be prepared as we begin the new year in January. But with our workshop and everything that we always do to kick off the year. But if you want to get involved, we'll talk more about that at the end. So
yes.
I'm handing it over to you.
So yeah, I think where we left off last time, I remember I had shared about my experience at college, and that was really the first time that I encountered this idea that Christianity really doesn't truly exist in the way that we think of it. It's really, we're all in some form of Reformed Judaism, right? So there's no, like, Paul came to reform Judaism. He came to let everyone know that everything in the law that had for centuries had been pointing to a Messiah was actually fulfilled and completed in Yeshua. So it wasn't starting a new religion. It was simply pointing out the completion or the fulfillment of what had been foretold, right? And so it makes a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense to us back then, but it leaves us with this nagging question of, well, then why did we forget our roots? I mean, if the Bible is so clear about it, and when you kind of think it through, just logically, it makes so much sense. So why is it that we got completely separated in the first place? Well, there's a couple of things that happened. Early Western Christianity widely embraced two major ideas that started this, that were really the seeds of this idea. Number one was that Israel had been rejected by her God, and two, that the quote church was now the new Israel.
Mhm.
And this wasn't just an argument brought out of left field. There was a reason for this. And so there was two key reasons that were brought up to support this notion. The first was the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD under the direction of Roman Emperor Titus. And then the second was the destruction of the Jewish nation in 135 AD, which was led at the time by the false messiah Simon Bar Kokhba. So following this defeat in the revolt, which is oftentimes just referred to as the Bar Kokhba revolt, hundreds of thousands of Jews were massacred. And the remaining survivors were dispersed into what was called the Gamut, or the diaspora, or exile. And so among those who managed to survive, many of those were sold into slavery. And so this really seemed to be the end, right? Between all of the Jews that had been slaughtered, all the ones that were enslaved, and the very few that remained that were actually free. So these events in history really marked the beginning of the decline of Jewish influence on Western Christianity. And then this view gets further amplified by a lot of the early church fathers who, hey, nobody's perfect. I don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But on the other hand, it's important to note that their influence was largely the reason why this anti-Judaism took hold. Like, how did it get so deeply embedded? Well, a lot of it had to do with those two historical events, and then it gets amplified by, for example, Ignatius of Antioch. In a letter to the Magnesians, which is modern day Turkey, he said this, quote, "To profess Jesus Christ while continuing to follow Jewish customs is an absurdity. The Christian faith does not look to Judaism. Judaism looks to Christianity, in which every other race and tongue that confesses a belief in God has not been comprehended." Justin Martyr claimed that the scriptures were, quote, "not yours," meaning the Jews, but ours, meaning the Christians. Irenaeus wrote, "The Jews, indeed, had they been aware of Christians' future existence, and that we should use these proofs from the scriptures, would themselves have never hesitated to burn their own scriptures, which do declare that all other nations partake of eternal life, and show that they who boast themselves as being the house of Jacob," meaning the house of Israel, "and the people of Israel are disinherited from the grace of God." I'm not going to read every one, but Tertullian said something, Origen of Alexandria, Eusebius of Caesarea. Augustine of Hippo was one of the few early church fathers to offer support for the Jews, but that was just more in the context of he believed they at least deserved respect and protection, but not necessarily that, we were forming a new faith, right? So,
and would you say that this is where an idea of replacement theology kind of comes in, where there's that idea?
Because the people that really formalized that idea of replacement theology, or sometimes it's called supersessionism, the people that came along and really kind of codified that, they were relying on a lot of the early writings of these influential church fathers. So again, you take those two major historical events, you couple them with, the early church fathers, which were writing, Antiochus, he died in 108 AD. Eusebius died in 339 AD. So you're looking at, roughly a 200-year period where these solid, influential, otherwise amazing church fathers had a very non-scriptural viewpoint. I mean, again, that's why I started this by, last week, just reading through the scriptures, both old and new, because I want to establish, look, this isn't an opinion. This is what the Bible teaches about this. So it's when you look at this, it's understandable why this idea would take root, but it also is why we need to understand history and why we need to understand our Hebrew roots so that we can kind of stand against this sort of thing. The other thing too is that when you think about, now you fast forward a little bit to Constantine, he convenes the first general church council at Nicaea in 325 AD. By 325 AD, though, anti-Semitism had already been fairly well entrenched in the church. And you have to ask yourself, is it just a coincidence that none of the 318 bishops who attended the Nicene Council were of Jewish ancestry? I mean, again, it's kind of hard to speak up for our Jewish roots when there's no Hebrew people there. And so that builds on, like I said, what we've been talking about to this point, the historical background, the early church fathers. And so now this anti-Judaic theology of Nicaea kind of, quote unquote, legitimized the anti-Semitic legislation that later church councils would pass. So just a couple of examples: the Council of Antioch in 341 prohibited Christians from celebrating Passover with the Jews, which is interesting. That meant that up to that point, they were doing that. So in 341, it required a formal declaration for them to stop doing that. Interesting. The Council of Laodicea in 364 prohibited Christians from observing the Jewish and biblical Sabbath. Some Christians had been observing both Sunday and the Sabbath. And the council also prohibited Christians from receiving gifts from Jews or matzah, which is unleavened bread, from Jewish festivals and other quote unquote impieties. So now, this is becoming a little bit more mainstream. It's becoming a little bit more the norm. Now this is, you could say, this has entered the drinking water of the church. And so this is why you start to see these sharper and sharper divisions between what Jesus himself in the Old Testament talked about as one body. So it's interesting, though. So these restrictions were going on, but it's also important to note that initially, at least, Judaism was not treated as a prohibited sect. For example, rabbis were granted the same basically the same privileges as Christian clergy. The laws also prevented Jews from being disturbed on their Sabbath or feast days. It protected their synagogues from being attacked, violated, burned, or frankly confiscated by the local officials. But these limits, there were limits. So, for example, Jews were encouraged to convert to Christianity, but Christians were forbidden to convert to Judaism. Christians were permitted to own Jewish slaves, but Jews were forbidden from owning Christian slaves. Christians were forbidden under penalty of death to marry Jews. Something called the Fiscus Judaicus, which was a Jewish tax, was reinstituted from earlier centuries. This is basically just a tax collection agency that was instituted to collect taxes that had been imposed on Jews in the Roman Empire after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And of course, fascinatingly enough, these revenues, once collected, were then directed to the Temple of Jupiter in Rome. So great. But these very limited protections would be relatively short-lived. And within a few decades, violence against Jews in their synagogues sadly became commonplace. And they were, for all intents and purposes, reduced to little more than second-class citizens, somewhat protected by the law and only barely tolerated. And so I'm giving a very brief overview, but this is basically what caused this division and then ultimate separation from our Jewish roots. And again, those roots are very, very clearly established in the scripture, both in Old and New Testament. So it's really sad that we've experienced such a divorce, really. And something else that kind of entered in and I think creates somewhat of a division is, this notion that Constantine somehow saved Christianity,
Mm.
which if you do any degree of historical research, what a joke that is. I mean, I don't know who his PR guy is, but wow, what a great job they did with Constantine. Now, technically, he converted to Christianity, but he stubbornly remained a devout Mithraist to his death. A Mithraist, by the way, is a worshiper of the sun god. Mithra was the Iranian god of the sun, justice, and war, and this is pre-Zoroastrian Iran, known in Mithras in the Roman Empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And this was a deity that was honored as the patron of loyalty to the emperor. So you can see why he would like that. Plus, it was also the god of the sun. And again, I mean, it's kind of like somebody who, a man who cheats on his wife with prostitutes every week, but he stays married.
Right.
Yeah, technically you're married, but okay.
Yeah.
So, like for example, there's an arch that he built after victory in battle, and this arch that he built, it was circa like 315 AD. It's adorned with symbols of the unconquered sun, not Christianity. He also put sculptures of river gods and depictions of the sun above the 2 small arches that he constructed in this. So this was basically a monument to paganism that, quote unquote, the Christian emperor Constantine created. And so, to be fair, while there were some aspects of pagan cult worship that he reformed, he continued to promote through traditions and practices. Keep in mind, when he made Christianity the law of the land, he didn't ban pagan religions. He just legalized Christianity. And so, for example, in 321, Constantine, the quote Christian emperor, declares the Day of the Sun to be a state holiday celebrated by Roman citizens. So they practiced the Sabbath up to then, and then now the reason that they worshipped on Sunday was because that's when Mithra, the god of the sun, was honored. Now, I'm not opening this can of worms into a debate over whether it's right or wrong to worship on Saturday or Sunday. I think the Bible makes clear, like when Paul is talking about, the meat that was offered to idols. Some people in their conscience, they couldn't eat it because they felt like it was impure. Other people, it was just a slab of meat. They didn't really care. It's up to your conscience. So I'm not trying to make a point here about when the church should meet. I am simply, though, pointing out that for thousands of years, they celebrated Sabbath. And then all of a sudden in 321 AD, we now have the Day of the Sun, and the worship of God, quote unquote, shifted to Sunday to honor Mithra, the god of the sun. So that's why that shift happened from Saturday to Sunday. That's just a historical fact that I'm pointing out. Do with it what you will. The other part is that Constantine's reign was a lot more political than spiritual in nature. When you really take a much closer look at it, you see that he was more concerned forging alliances between church and state in order to maintain stability throughout the empire than he was really developing and building a personal relationship with God. In 313 AD, this is a little bit before the Council of Nicaea, Constantine had met with Licinius in Italy to formulate what became known as the Edict of Milan. So this legalized Christianity along with all other religions and cults in the Roman Empire. However, once Christianity was granted this official recognition, Christians were no longer targeted for persecution by the pagans. So there was that. But like I said, skipping ahead to what we touched on earlier about the Nicene Council, in 325, it's convened, and the purpose was to create a universal religion / church in order to strengthen the Roman Empire. And so as emperor, Constantine presided over this entire council, whose representation was, of course, conspicuously greater among the wealthier churches, since the poorer churches couldn't afford the exorbitant expense of sending an emissary more than thousands of miles to attend this council. Catholic Encyclopedia even said this: some bishops, blinded by the splendor of the court, even went so far as to laud the emperor as an angel of God, as a sacred being, and to prophesy that he would, like the Son of God, reign in heavens. These are people who are supposedly Christians making this claim about the emperor who worshipped the sun god. So much so that he decided to reverse thousands of years of traditional Sabbath worship and shift worship to Sunday to honor Mithra, the sun god.
And isn't it also true that he basically really took out the Hebrew, like the feasts and all of those things as well? Like they weren't.
Well, that was already happening.
Oh, that had already happened.
Like, in other words, the church fathers had already kind of planted that notion of we need to kind of divorce ourselves from all things Jewish. And then, later on, it became a little bit more pronounced, and where, then you got some actual restrictions from like the Council of Antioch, Council of Laodicea, which put these restrictions on. And then from that, it just expanded and grew from there. But I find that fascinating that this is something that is spoken about, this quote Nicene Council, which has this very kind of sacred notion. And again, I'm not saying this to completely denigrate the council. There were good things that happened there, but I think we should look at everything that happened there, and not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but be also very willing to cast an honest look at what went down. So Nicaea happens, and the quote unquote Christian emperor Constantine very quickly casts aside whatever his faith was in order to start ruthlessly consolidating his political power. So Constantine has Licinius. He was the husband of his half sister. He had him strangled. Then he had the son of Licinius flogged to death. Then in 326, he had Crispus, his firstborn son, strangled. And then later that year, Constantine had Fausta, his second wife, boiled alive. So, I mean, if that sounds a little bit unchristian to your ears, yeah, it kind of does. I mean, most of us are struggling with other things, like maybe greed or envy or other things like that. We're not really having our sons strangled. But anyways, so this is kind of one of those things where it's just, again, the mythology of the Christian emperor, right? Chaim McCoby made, I think, an especially appropriate observation on Constantine's so-called faith. And he said, quote, "Nothing is more welcome to a military empire than a religious doctrine that counsels obedience and acquiescence." Because remember, the Bible does talk about, following the leaders until they call you to violate anything that God has instructed you to do. So I think that just this little short trip down memory lane, it's pretty clear that Constantine had a considerable measure of his pagan inclinations left. It's also kind of interesting to note that it was during this era that the cross became a sacred symbol in Christianity. Some scholars have even suggested it was alternatively used in various pagan religions. And again, that's like an interesting debate. That's like a sidebar. But like I said, the edict that declared the quote venerable day of the sun, Sunday, was issued at the Council of Nicaea. And so, these pagan activities were surprisingly widespread during supposedly the leadership of a Christian emperor. And so what began to happen in the course of all this now moving forward is that Passover was celebrated by the Christian church, but Gentiles began to create more separation. They started to differentiate their Passover from the Jewish Passover. And then to complete these transitions, the bishops moved the Christian celebration of Passover to the first Sunday after the Jewish Passover in most years. For example, the Jewish Passover always lands on the 14th day of Nisan, which can fall on any day of the week. Centuries later, now we're kind of skipping through history kind of rapidly. Even the name Pesach, or Passover, was so distasteful in the Christian church that they replaced it with Easter. Easter comes from Eostre, the English month Bede, in he lived 672 to 735. He's known as the father of English history, and he wrote that the pagans in England called April Estermonab, or which is Old English for the month of Eostre. This is a supposedly Christian holiday that's now known as Easter, but that was called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honors feasts were celebrated that month. She was also known as the goddess of fertility, dawn, or light. So again, I'm not trying to open up a can of worms on debate whether people should or shouldn't celebrate Easter, or how that is, or the symbology that's linked in Easter with the bunnies and the fertility and the eggs and so forth. All I'm saying is that it's absolutely a historical fact that this is where this celebration came from. It came from the pagan celebration of a fertility goddess. And so this is, again, I'm not trying to make any kind of statement on what you ought to do. I'm just simply pointing out this is history. This is what happened in history. And so when you think about it, by this time, the practice of christening had started, which was already widely believed to make one a, quote, Christian. Now, some of this is the after effects of plagues, and so children were baptized because who knew how long they would actually live. But then it kind of broadened and became something more than that. But infant baptism, eventually by 416 AD, had become compulsory for the entire Roman Empire. And any followers of Jesus who rejected this law were then forbidden from identifying as Christian because they had not been, quote, christened into Christendom. And those guilty of committing this heresy were often punished by death. So, I mean, this is something that they took pretty seriously.
Wow.
So when we look at this, Western Christianity is not really any different than any other historical group, religious or otherwise. There's blood on its hands. And while the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church are rightfully condemned, neither would she conveniently ignore the uglier aspects of historical Protestantism, if you want to call it that. I mean, we're all human, right? So it doesn't benefit us to avoid the arrogant indulgence of believing that theological errors and religious excesses are exclusively confined to other religions. That's why we center our faith on God, not a religion. That's why we center our faith on his word and not on their traditions or histories of mankind. We don't rely on humanistic wisdom. We rely on God's. God's wisdom can always be trusted. Man's wisdom, well, I mean, results may vary, right? As we can see from the study of history. So this is a very, very brief. We try to kind of condense this quickly because we could very easily do hours and hours and hours on this, but the point is just give you a very brief overview of how did we get from this place where we go from our identity is inextricably linked, right, to the Jew and Gentile are part of the same root in Jesus, and then over time we're separated and then completely divided. And sometimes we wonder why Jews are kind of antagonistic towards Christians. Well, look at the history.
Yeah.
Look at the history. And and there's so much in our own history that we have whitewashed and that we have just sort of glossed over very conveniently. And when you start looking at all of it in its full context, you see, oh, this is why we were separated. And why would the enemy want to do that? Well, it's kind of like the enemy is trying to make all of us orphans. He doesn't want to know our true heritage. He doesn't want to know where we came from. He doesn't want us to know to who do we belong, who our ancestors were, who our identity is. He wants to obscure as much of that as possible. And so this was a great way to do it. And he just sort of created division and more division. And we've gotten further and further away from what God says is true and closer to what various groups of men have said is true.
Yeah.
Where we are now.
That's incredible. And there is so much in here just that Dan has pulled together in our Living Inspired Guide. We were going to break it down into 2, and I'm looking going, oh my gosh, there's enough here for like probably 6 of these, because we want to keep them, kind of tight in about a 30-minute little live here. But it's so important. And I remember when I really first was hearing about all that, and even this time rereading it, like it hit me differently, really, because I've read some of these early church fathers, different things, and it's always been like, oh my gosh, there's so much power there. But then to hear that that's where this misleading started happening, and they were misled, they were, I'm sure preaching something that they really believed was true and was right. So it was very interesting to see that anti-Semitic and the shift there. So yeah, there's so much more that we want to break into. We wanted to talk a little bit next week about why Greek and not Hebrew for the New Testament. So many things about where some of this came from. There's a lot. There's so much more that we will probably talk about next week, which will be the night before Thanksgiving. So we probably will go ahead and go live. That way, if you're busy getting ready for the dinner, you can watch it at a different time if that doesn't work out. But I think we will go ahead and go so that we can try to wrap up what we have here. We want to definitely encourage you. We'll be letting you know when the book for next year goes live. If you are part of the membership, you will get that book sent out to you. You can order it. It'll be available on Amazon. And it is a workbook that takes you through the whole year. And that's what we do our coaching out of. That's what we do our group coaching out of. We also do a big kickoff in January where we do a one-day workshop. And I came across this today. I have this hanging. So we choose a word or a phrase, and we always have gifts that come with especially when we do our workshop. And so last year, these were our gifts that we mailed out to you guys, that we made and mailed out. And my word for this year has been dominion rest. Such a powerful word. It is different from Sabbath rest being that you have that day of rest, that time of rest. Dominion rest is when you feel the peace and the rest and the surrender, when you are aligned with God's will. And it's like you are going along with him, you are partnering with him, and you are experiencing that as you are stepping into your calling and where he is leading you. It's how I'm picturing it, like an adventure with him. And what's been so cool is we get the opportunity when we meet to talk about what did that word come to mean to you over the year. So I don't know what my word is going to be yet for next year. It usually comes to me at some point, but I'm super excited about that. And I just wanted to share with you guys the keys that we made last year, and to remind, we'll think of something cool for this year. But it's so awesome when we do our group in January. And we have a question. We had a question from Jana, and Jana's question was, I would like to understand what Zionism is, and Zionistic Jews and Christians, and anti-Zionism, and when all that started. So on the spot, what do you have to share about that?
Well, Zionism is basically a political movement. And so some people will mark it to Theodor Herzl, others will move it further back. But basically, it was the idea that Israel should be given the right of return to their homeland. and it kind of, what makes it a little bit confusing and why there's kind of some overlap is that it had initially, it was, more or less a spiritual movement, and then it kind of coalesced and became absorbed into a political movement. And so there's kind of sometimes a strange crossover between the two. And that's kind of where we're getting the, I guess it's not necessarily confusion, but that's where there's kind of like, I think, a bit of, where people get, where it becomes controversial or heated. And of course there's a lot of conflict over the region of Palestine, which God promised to his people. And so, over time, there's like layers of politicization to it. It's kind of a broader type. I mean, it might be a good topic. I did write a paper on it, just sort of studying it, because there's a lot. It's hard to get into it too much because it doesn't make sense unless you can talk about the context of it. But in order to talk about the context of it, you need a lot of time.
How long is your paper?
It's 76 pages.
Oh my gosh. And I can tell you now, it's going to have, so what is that called? Footnotes and everything. We would be happy to share it. Would you be happy to share that?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Yeah, we can actually put it in the group. We'll put it in there as a file and you can check it out. Yeah. When Dan writes a paper, it's a paper. It's footnoted. It's no joke. It is no joke. That's why our book keeps getting longer and longer too. It's amazing. I am so excited about this next version of this book. Yeah. Every level of it, we've leveled up on that. Great question, Jana. I'm interested too in understanding that more, like what is anti-Zionist and what is Zionist. There is a lot of talk about that lately. And I think it is with this war going on.
Yeah.
Especially
some of the anti stuff, is like there's anti-Semitic and there's like a hatred for Judaism, right? But then some of it is they're fine with the Jews in general, but they don't like the political movement, and they don't, and so that's where you get like that back and forth of, and kind of that confusion, because it's kind of a religious movement, but it's also politicized. And then that gets mixed up and mixed in. And then you have people that don't like Zionism for different reasons, and so it's just, yeah.
Yeah, that would be interesting because I don't totally understand it either. And so I would love to read that. So we also wanted to invite you guys. You probably heard because we went live on Sunday, but we're going to do a book club. I'm very excited about this. This is the first time we're doing this. We thought, what could we do through the holiday season, through a time that is busy, but also in a way things slow down a little bit. Work kind of slows down. You're doing holiday things and there's not as much business sometimes going on during the end of the year. So it's also a time that we want to be intentional about time with our family and time with God. And so this book is a powerful book on understanding and really fighting for your heart and how the heart is essential. And so we thought, what a perfect thing to read to prepare us for the new year when we want to really step into that new season. So if you haven't already, you can download this. We've got a link in the group there. You can go on Amazon, look up The Journey of Desire by John Eldredge. We're going to meet this Sunday night at 7:00 Central Time for our first just discussion. It'll be on Zoom. I think we have a link that the Zoom link, I probably posted it, that you can register for your spots and just come on. It's free. You don't have to be at all of them. We are going to meet every Sunday until the 5th of January, except December 1st. We have plans. We're going to be out of town, but that's the only night we can't, which is the second week there. But we're going to discuss this Sunday night. We'll be talking about the first 2 chapters. I am super excited. It's great to see you guys. I have my phone over here so I can see who's on. I wanted to say hello to Mackenzie, to Jana, to Tad, Amanda, and I can't see the other names. We are just so happy that you guys are here watching with us. It says 3 other people, and I can't see what the names are, but welcome, welcome. We're so happy to have you guys. Check it out. The history is so important of understanding our Hebrew roots, and it just makes everything so much more powerful. So we love having you guys with us. We will be back next Wednesday for part 3 for part 3 of the understanding the Hebrew roots of our Christian faith. So with that said, we're going to say
Shalom,
good
y'all.
Shalom.